So just a few announcements from the community. First of all, the MPSA panel deadline is coming up shortly. Panels, if you're interested in being on an NPF panel, we need that information by Monday, September 30th. And we will work to build panels from the submissions. And if your paper is not selected for inclusion and proposal, we'll notify you by Friday, October 4th. So you can submit the paper as a freestanding submission before the MPSA established deadline of October 8th. So I can add this information to the chat after I'm done with the rest of the announcements. The next announcement, if there's a question about who is going to ICPP in Thailand in July 2025. If you are going, please let Liz Shanahan know if that is what you intend to do. We have another announcement about our NSF RCN proposal. So we are making progress. As some of you know, we are in the process of applying, or rather, we haven't applied yet. We're in the process of writing our RCN grant proposal. This began with, if you've been following along, for those of you that are new to the NPF community, we're interested in finding additional funding to support initiatives like this community workshop. An NSF RCN will help us support opportunities to bring our community together to address pertinent issues that will help advance the NPF framework. Two of the main issues that we're working towards advancing are advancements in coding, as well as theoretical advancements. So those are the two areas that we are applying our RCN grant for. But basically an RCN funds the infrastructure to bring us together to support that work. So our monthly workshops, our opportunities to come together at conferences, and our opportunities to create freestanding meetings and other abilities to bring perhaps grad students together for workshops as well would be supported through this initiative if we are to get it. So the announcement really is that we're making progress on writing the grant, and we hope to have that completed by mid-October to then bring our community back together to provide an additional update and for your feedback as well. The next update is we are looking for, so we're currently updating our website, and over the next few weeks, we will continue to change and modify the website's design to provide current information and support to our community of scholars. As part of updating the website, we'd also like to include information about current NPF scholars. So this part of the website will share current bibliographic information about scholars, research interests, and areas of expertise. We hope that keeping up-to-date information about those who engage in NPF work will continue to contribute to our goals of sharing information. So as part of this endeavor, we'd really appreciate it if you filled out a survey by June 7th. June 7th, is that the correct date? That's not the correct date. No. So I will add that information to the chat, the link to the survey, but it is not July 7th, June 7th. It's as soon as you can get it in, hopefully by the end of October, so we can get that information updated on the website. And another note, if anyone who is in this workshop today is interested in helping to support the updating of the website, and perhaps if you have any key skills in website updating, please let me know, because I'm working on that and I would love some support and assistance. So if this is an area of interest to you, it's a great way to get involved, but also we definitely need your help. Okay, and I will add both of that information, both of those information pieces to the chat in just a moment. Is there any other announcement from the community or any correction to the announcements that I made that should be made before we move on? Anything else anyone would like to share? Okay. I think that is it for announcements. We will also have an opportunity at the end for discussion. So if there is something that you would like to share at the end of our panel, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So there will be another opportunity to share information and resources at that point in time. I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy, who will be facilitating the panel.
Thank you so much, Honey and Eula. And before we move on, I just want to say how much it warms my heart to see this amazing group of people that have gathered here today, people that I know and people that I don't know, which is also very, very exciting. I want to clarify one thing about the Scholars Survey. My assumption is that it's like a more is more. I have a hard time sometimes calling myself a scholar. I have a feeling that sometimes people, like if you're a PhD candidate or student, you might have a hard time saying, can I really claim that term scholar? But my understanding is that we really want anybody who's working in the NPF to fill out this survey so that we can form better connections on that. Is that assumption correct? All right. Okay, great. And I see lots of good stuff coming up in the chat as well. So just wanted to make sure we all understand that. We're going to turn at this point, and we're going to spend about 10 minutes just talking with two scholars. We did a series of community forums over the past spring, and we heard from people that people want more opportunities to connect with each other outside of conferences. That's why we're doing this, and we want more opportunities to connect with each other as people. So I'm really, really excited to have Ariel Bertrand and Caroline Schlaufer as our first sort of spotlight folks. So I've sent them a couple of questions, and we're going to just get to know them for a little bit, and then we're going to go into our main panel after that. So Ariel is she has let us know, and you should snap her up as quickly as you can, is on the job market right now. Caroline is at the University of Bern, so we have both sort of a new and emerging and also someone with more experience in the NPF, and they also work on different continents, but they share a lot in common. And because we were putting this together, I got to choose these folks and reach out to them. And I think they're just, I love reading their work. I love their writing. I love the rigor that they bring to their research. So I'm going to ask you first, Ariel, how did you learn about the NPF and why were you drawn to using it for your research? And what tools and ideas do you find intriguing and useful?
All right, thank you so much. That was very kind of you. I first learned about the NPF in my undergraduate public policy course. I think that without my undergraduate mentor, Dr. Young, introducing me to the framework in class, that I don't know that I would even be here today. I was really drawn to the NPF because I'd always wondered about the way that people seem to frame their world around stories, and that these stories really seem to matter more to people than facts or evidence. Before I came to graduate school, I worked as a legislative assistant in the Missouri House of Representatives. And that was something that I just like saw over and over and over again, was that these like powerful stories seem to matter much more than any facts or evidence or anything else that you could like come to bring to bear on the policy process. And so that's what really brought me to want to study the narrative policy framework more in graduate school. Yeah. And
makes perfect sense. Yeah, go ahead. And then any tools and ideas that you find most intriguing and useful?
Yeah, so something that has been like incredibly fascinating to me and that I've been thinking about a lot lately is how narratives can be used strategically to expand or constrict the scope of conflict. And I've been thinking about that a lot in relation to my work on school boards. So Schatzsnyder said, I might mess the quotes up a little bit, but like one way to constrict a scope of conflict is to localize it, and one way to expand it is to nationalize it. And so I've been thinking about a lot about this with school board elections and curriculum decisions becoming nationalized through the strategic use of narrative. So we see these like really national conflicts like critical race theory, book bans, becoming like they're tapping into these like really emotional and ideological nationalized ideas and framing it in a local context. And that's something that I've just been thinking about a lot, how they're used to just either expand or constrict the scope of conflict.
Great.
Using narratives.
Great. Yeah, I want to ask 12,000 questions about that, but we'll turn to Caroline and ask her the same question. How did you first learn about the NPF? Why were you drawn to using it? And what tools and concepts do you find intriguing and useful?
Thanks, Katie, for the organization of this great workshop and for picking me for this panel. But I wasn't as lucky to learn about the NPF in my undergrads because I'm a bit too old for that. I wrote my PhD on the topic of how scientific evidence is politically used in policy debates. So I was searching for a concept of how can I analyze debates. And I came first across arguments, and I analyzed the arguments, and then I realized it's not satisfying because people don't always put forward just arguments, but they talk in stories. And when I realized that, I was very happy to learn that there is a lot about policy narratives, and I started reading. And in the beginning, I wasn't really clear about that there is the NPF and that there are post-positivist scholars. It was all kind of a bit messy. And I remember I presented for first time, I guess it was the ICPP in Milan in a LIS panel. And the discussant said, well, you have to decide whether you're kind of using the NPF or whether you use interpretivist narrative analysis. And only then it really became clear to me, well, there's different things. And yeah, what I really like about the NPF is that it has a very clear empirical approach. I'm an empirical scholar, and the NPF gives me a clear guidance on how I do empirical work. So I really like this structural approach that can be applied almost everywhere. This is the advantage of the NPF, maybe also a little bit the disadvantage, because by categorizing things, we maybe forget about other things that we don't see because we cannot put them in these categories.
Great. And Caroline, I'm going to ask you and Ariel to toot your own horn for a second and just tell us a contribution that you've made to the NPF. So we'll start with you, Caroline. What's something that you've added to sort of theory or knowledge of the NPF?
I guess it's my work about how scientific evidence is used in narratives, because usually we always compare whether narratives are stronger than scientific facts. When I looked at the debates, I realized people in debates, they don't just argue with fact lists. They always use the scientific evidence as a part of a story. And that's what I introduced to the NPF. And I guess the second contribution is that I applied the NPF in a non-democratic context. I worked for several years in Russia, and we had a project, an NPF project, and about 5 or 6 articles came out of this work of analyzing narratives in an authoritarian context.
Yeah, awesome. And what about you, Ariel? What contributions have you made?
So I recently published an article in PSJ with 2 wonderful co-authors, Dr. Mimi Arnold-Lyon and Dr. Rebecca Jacobson. And so in this paper, we bridge micro, meso, and macro level narratives by introducing this concept of narrative spillover. And so this is this idea that when you hear narratives, it may not only impact public opinion, but also bridge over into these ideas about macro level narratives. And so we did this by asking people in Michigan how often they had heard narrative plots about critical race theory that had been advocated for during debates across the country when they were trying to ban it. And in the United States, we have really strong macro level narrative beliefs about public schooling, like this idea that public schooling is a cornerstone to democracy and that we really trust our local schools, we trust our local teachers, even if we don't always feel the same way about these things nationally. And we found that the more often that people heard these narratives, it not only seemed to shape their opinion on whether it should be banned, but also shape their macro level beliefs about public schools, and people seem to trust their local schools less as they heard these narratives. And so really this concept of narrative spillover is what I've introduced to the NPF, and I really hope that people can keep using this concept and studying it, because I think that especially in the United States and probably around the world, as political discourse has gotten more negative, less respectful, less fact-based, narratives are going to continue to have this bridge with our macro level beliefs about things such as democracy and things like that. So.
Great. Thank you so much. I love all of the articles that you all are mentioning. They're ones that, as I went through, these are key insights and really helpful concepts to take further. I'm gonna skip to the last question that I asked you to think about. We want to know something about you that has absolutely nothing to do with the NPF, nothing to do with research, nothing to do with academia whatsoever. Share a little bit about yourself, Ariel. What's a fun fact about you?
Yeah, so I've recently started getting into the hobby of building Lego sets. It is not just for kids. It has actually been so helpful for my mental health as I've been working on my dissertation, because it's something that, isn't looking at a screen. It's still like building something and creative and kind of like helps my brain wind down. So I really like to roller skate. So this is a roller skate that I built. And then I am also a nerd and I love Mario. So this is the piranha plant that I built. So yeah, I love Legos, and this one's cool because it has little coins and they drop out. So
Wow.
yeah. And then my treat to myself for how hard this year was going to be is the Starry Nights Van Gogh set. So that's what I've been building. But yeah, I encourage everyone, start building Lego. It helps.
All right. We are going to build a segment into the next agenda where everyone just brings their Lego creations. I appreciate that. Thank you for the show and tell. And Caroline, what about you? What's something that has nothing to do with the NPF research or academia?
I'm really jealous of the Lego skills of Ariel. I'm not a patient person. I could never do that. So that's great. Well, I'm a mom of two pre-teenage kids. So they're not really my hobby. I mean, they're my life. They both love rock music. And so we spend a lot of time singing very loud. And I play them all the songs that I loved when I was like 15. And I sing very wrong, so poor neighbors.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ariel and Caroline. I have a feeling that as you were talking, there were people that were here that were thinking, gosh, I want to ask them about their work, or, oh, I want to connect on different things. And we want to encourage you to do that through the chat and in different ways. And you all did a fantastic job in our very first spotlight, and a reminder that we're all real people who come to this through different routes and have important contributions to make. All right, so we'll turn over now to the main topic of today, which is our panel. And we've invited some really, really wonderful, interesting, smart, helpful people to be a part of this with us. I'm going to just quickly make sure I can, we've created, I guess, just a couple slides, and I'll put that link in the chat. And we'll kind of bring them up and then pull them down at different times, because this really isn't a slideshow, so to speak. And then if you know me, you know I always get hung up on getting this part right. Slideshow. Yay, you can see this. All right, so we have Mike Jones, Mark Macbeth, Liz Shanahan, Aaron Smith-Walter, and Geoboo Song, who back in, I'm not sure when they started this, probably 2021, 2022, they started the work of creating the third NPF chapter in the 5th edition of Theories of the Policy Process, aka the Orange Theory on the left-hand side. And then the 1st edition, this is the first time we've had Methods of the Policy Process, and Geoboo helped with that chapter, and then the other folks were authors on both of these chapters. And we're just gonna kind of go through some of the main points of the of what you found in the chapters. And I believe, Mike, the first question will go to you. We really want to know, these are important. It's important when a new Theories of the Policy Process comes out. It's an event. Everybody wants to read it. Everybody wants to understand what's going to be different. And as you all sat down to create this new chapter, what were your goals for this? What did you want to accomplish, knowing that this was going to be an occasion? What did you want to achieve? Any contributions that you particularly wanted to make with this chapter?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost that I think it's a charge that we all take very, very seriously. There's a certain kind of weight that comes with it. And I think the first thing that we wanted to do was make sure that that the update was substantive, right? We
Mhm.
didn't just want to copy and paste what was written in the previous years and just put something out quickly. And so kind of sorting through all of the existing NPF work is a bit of a challenge on its own, but we wanted to take that very seriously. We wanted to update concepts and relationships. We wanted to engage the kind of disagreements that have popped up in the literature, and there are a few. We wanted to address the vagaries. There was an important charge kind of leveled at theories of the policy process in general about the lack of causal mechanisms. Wellstad and his crew wrote this great article that really took the theories to the woodshed, I thought. And we were part of that. And we wanted to address that. We wanted to clarify, add, remove, all of those sorts of things, while making sure that we weren't doing it by fiat, right? We didn't just want to step in and say, we are going to make decisions and this is how the world is going to be. We wanted to have a conversation with the literature. And you can find all the summaries at the in the appendix, or not the summaries, but you can find a list of the things that we engage, or at least the critical things that we engage at the end of the chapter in theories of the policy process. And we kind of list the things that we dealt with. Strategies, we put in a new figure, we added sections on narrators and audience, which seemed kind of like a duh moment in the sense that they weren't there to begin with. So we have a lot of duh moments when we're looking at this stuff. We addressed some issues with levels of analysis. We kind of tackled some issues a little sideways because we weren't sure how to address them, like time, right? We know time is an issue and that it's multifaceted and that it hasn't really been addressed very well in the NPF, but that was one of those things that we just didn't feel like we had enough literature out there to kind of speak to what where the NPF was on it. So we punted a little bit and put a footnote and kind of mentioned the debate and that people need to get to work on that. But I don't want to take up too much time. There's quite a few questions. And,
Great.
you can find the appendix there. And
yeah, and hopefully if I'm doing this right, I'm sharing my screen correctly and you can see that slide with the appendix. Okay, great. And Erin, I'll ask you to just kind of briefly give us the highlights. We've got this in front of us, but we want to ask you, as you all were doing this work, what concepts stayed basically the same? And what do you think are some of the biggest changes that came about that you'd want to highlight?
Yeah, I think first off, the major challenge that we're wrestling with, I think, is that everyone keeps doing such really awesome and interesting work in the framework that really reading all the outputs that people had produced in between the fourth edition and the delivery date for the fifth was wonderful, but at the same time kind of daunting, right? Because as the community grows, the output grows, and then the synthesis becomes harder. And in these chapters, they don't necessarily expand the number of pages that they give us, right? So we really did have to do a lot of that work, and it's a credit to the community that it was hard because it was high quality work, right? It was not a whole lot of stuff that we're just like, we can set that aside. So that was the first thing that I think we really wrestled with. And when I look back at the changes that we made, there are four that really stick out to me as the ones that I think are deserving of, or that's not true, not deserving. These are the ones that stick most in my mind, that if I had to highlight four, these would be the ones that I would pick. And the first is sort of the explicit articulation of characters as foundational to the building of the framework. So if you take a look at figure 5.1, what you basically see are like these two inverted pyramids. And what they do is they really center, right, characters at the core of what we're doing. And that was something that we saw both in the empirical work that we reviewed and also when we reviewed sort of the theory, right? Characters really became foundational. So we can sort of see that, you start there and then you begin to build, right? And then as you add these aspects, the narratives become more complicated. And then I also think that we wrestled with the sort of relation between these increasingly sort of abstract and difficult to quantify aspects of the narratives as we move into the narrative content itself, right? So we tried to be a little bit more explicit about which aspects of form and content we might see reflected and mirroring one another in these pyramids. So I think that that was a pretty important change that we made that I hope is helpful for people in explaining sort of how this theory is put together. I also think that highlighting the new section that deals with the importance of sort of the narrator is important. You know, when we looked at a lot of the work that was coming out, you know, and Kathy and Melissa Mary, I certainly had major voices here. You know, I think Mike said it, right? It was that sort of duh moment. Yeah, like, yeah, they're narrative creators, right? And we need to consider what that means because, you know, when we consume narratives, right, there are different ways we do it. We consume them as scholars, we're thinking about them in a particular way. When we consume them as citizens, right, we may be consuming and thinking about them in a different way. But then there's also, how do we think about them when we're creating them? And so I think that thinking about the narrative creation, right, adds a whole new dimension to the framework that really brings in a lot of interesting research questions that can be developed and explored by people who are interested in expanding the framework. The third thing that I think is really sort of sticks in my head is sort of the inclusion of the solidarity shift as a partner measurement to the devil angel shift. And I don't say that the solidarity shift is the only way to measure victims, or maybe I shouldn't say that it's even the best way that we can think about it. What I think is important about the measure is that it really began to, it elevated victims in this sort of trifecta, right, of those three characters into a measurable sort of standard, right? So if we're thinking about narratives, we want to think about the empirical aspects of the narrative form, and victims are a real big part of narratives, or at least they could be. And so I think that bringing them, you know, sort of into that group was important, you know. And it's not to say it hasn't been criticized. Anybody who was at Copper got to see, you know, Chris Weibel, you know, take me to task, right, for maybe developing an theoretical measurement concept. You know, like, well, why do we measure this? What's the theory behind it, right? And so I'm not saying that solidarity shift is the only way, only that the interplay between these three types of characters are really part of the driving engine behind what makes policy narratives work, right? We got to have problems, we got to have solutions, we got to think about the ways that we frame those. So we can think about who causes them, we can think about who's going to solve them, and then we can think about who's having them. And so I think that that was a really important explicit articulation that we made here. And then the last thing that I think we did here that I'm going to highlight, because there's a lot of smart people on this call who would benefit from sharing what they have to say instead of me babbling on, is the articulation of the normative stance, right? The normative preferences that the NPF has. And here's something that I think, you know, we have articulated, that we have a normative preference for democratic systems of governance. And the reason there is simple, that if you think that narratives matter, you have to be able to share and exchange narratives free of pressure and oppression, right? And censorship. Unfortunately, we see, right, freedom of speech in retreat almost everywhere, right? The U.S. certainly is no exception to that. In many cases, we lead in many measures on exactly how that works. So the articulation that we made there, that this is something that scholars should value, I think is something which sets the NPF apart from any of the other policy process frameworks. In that this normative commitment is now, or preference is now, explicit. And then the second piece of that is that if we're going to value everybody's free speech, right, their ability to contribute to the construction, exchange, and evaluation of these narratives, the evaluation piece is key, right? Because we do have people, right, who, you know, if you read Berkland's intro text, like I make my students read, right, you don't need facts to tell a policy story, right? You don't even need facts to tell a good policy story. You're not necessarily going to solve the problems, though, if you don't use the right facts. And so what we also do is we issue a normative preference, not only for democracy as the preferred sort of modality for dealing with these types of narratives and governance systems, but also a preference for science as a way to evaluate these truth claims. Again, not the only way we can evaluate them, right? Maybe not even the most powerful way in certain respects, but certainly the narrative policy framework and our articulation in the 5th edition here is that these are our preferred modalities, right? Democratic exchange of ideas and a scientific basis for the facts that we put into our stories.
Thank
So those
you,
are
Aaron.
big.
Yeah, those are helpful, those 4 areas in particular, the characters, the solidarity shift, the normative aspect, and now I'm forgetting the other one, but we'll go on to Liz because we're going to look specifically at one pretty big change, which is the models of policy change. We have a new figure in this that's the mechanisms of policy change, and I'm going to pull that up in a second. Liz, you also have a comment in the chat, so anything you want to add on that, and then we'll go into the these models of policy change and how you all put that together.
Thanks so much, Kathy. So this, thank you. So what is it called? Narrative mechanisms of policy change. I just want to sort of take a step back. Like all theories of the policy process, what are we interested in, right? We're interested in policy change and why that happens and why it doesn't, status quo. And back in the day, this was Adela Schlager's quote. She said, the narrative policy framework is bringing a class of variables to the policy process that we didn't have before, and that is that of narrative. And so you see narrative content and narrative form. And again, I'm going to give a big shout out to Aaron for putting that figure. He didn't take credit for it, but he did it with the relationship between narrative form and content. And so I think in this chapter, we started thinking about relationships, right? So relationship between form and content. And really, when you start thinking about relationship, you start thinking about sort of links between ideas. And so the big question is like, what do narratives do and how do they do what they do in the policy process? And that's really what a narrative mechanism is. So we know, from started with Mike's research to Jones, 2014, the power of heroes, and that has been repeated over time. And now people are starting to look at how different, and Mark Macbeth and his crew, different array of characters, right, in the narrative and what those effects are. But then we started thinking but how are these effects occurring? And Chris Weibel and his lab are doing a deep dive into affect, and affect has exploded in the policy literature, I think, as far as being a really important mechanism of change. And so how that is operationalized is could be a whole special issue, actually. And then what does, if someone, and so we have, narrative transportation. So you think about narrative transportation, I've often equated that with affect. That's a delimited perspective on, I think, what Brock and Green would say of what narrative transportation is. But that's one of the ways I've operationalized that in my work. And so narratives that move people, in some affective way, you can say emotions, you can say balance. To what end, right? It could be that you start paying more attention. It could be that it has this pretty profound shift in your belief system. It could be, in that way, persuasive, manipulative. And actually, one of the questions I have with regard to narrative spillover is so here we have learning, right? So what is spillover and what is learning? That was one of my questions for you. And then, but it also could, get people mobilized, and it could mobilize at different levels of analysis, right? Macro. So we were and are continuing to think about and base these ideas, as Chris sort of said to Aaron, Chris Weibel said to Aaron, base these ideas in a lot of work in different fields, cognitive psychology, social psychology, marketing, et cetera. And so we want to understand narrative mechanisms as these underlying linkages between inputs, right? And so that would be your narrative and all content and form, and then what we're trying to understand, which is policy change.
And Liz, there's this, do you want to speak to this one as well? Is it any differences? I mean, I put the one from the previous edition and the new edition on here.
Well,
I don't know if
I think what's really helpful for me is to see figures in in manuscripts, because it helps me understand what people are trying to do and where they're trying to do this larger system. And so when you think about a mechanism, it's like, what are the pieces that make something, that some phenomena happen? And so this is the meso level. And actually, wasn't it you, Kathy, who actually improved this in one of your pieces? And so we've just taken, in terms of narrative components, right? We just went back to form and content and didn't differentiate out beliefs from strategies there. But again, what we're trying to understand is policy change, and through what mechanisms, right? Attention, persuasion, manipulation, and there's others, right? And other ideas in there too, in terms of how should we measure narrative effects, essentially, just like we measure media effects. How are we measuring and understanding narrative effects?
Thank you. I agree. I like seeing figures too, because it's where all the words have to come into these like basic concepts, right? To know exactly what we're thinking. I'm going to turn the next question to Mark Macbeth. And this is one that is always so funny because it seems like this should be really simple. The levels of analysis, micro, meso, and macro, and they seem simple and intuitive, but it's also really clear to me that both in the orange book and in the blue book, there's some pains that you all are taking as authors to say something more specific potentially than what we're seeing in some research about what these levels mean. So I'll put those slides up, but Mark, can you help us understand how you all approached this in your deliberations?
Sure, thanks, Kathy. So it is interesting. I was going to start right where Kathy left off there, which is, to me, the three levels of analysis, which has been part of the NPF since its original articulation back in 2010, is very clear to me. But having reviewed lots of NPF articles and then teaching the NPF in my courses, people get the levels of analysis very confused. So one of the things that we try to do in this, in the new version of the theories of the policy process, is really define what those levels are. And there's a footnote, right? And so there's kind of a joke within the group that if you have a footnote, that is Mike Jones' footnotes. So the footnote in the levels of policy process that talks about the differences between, for example, levels of government or units of observation, and the differences between the three levels, I think, is really important. At the micro level, the way I think of the micro level originally, and it's changing, the micro level is how individuals are informed by narratives, right? And how they react, how they consume narratives. I always think the micro level is how individuals consume narratives, and that includes hypotheses about trust and congruence, incongruence, and other things. Although we're going to talk in a minute that is now changing in the new level. We now look at how individuals actually produce narrative. So at the meso level, which I think that's kind of the origins of the NPF, that is how groups and policy actors use narratives strategically or as reflections of policy beliefs in a subsystem. And I think that is the core of, the origins of the NPF is at that level, at the meso level. And then the macro level, of course, is how narratives are embedded in culture and institutions and shape policy. So I think what is interesting about the new edition is we have some really significant additions to the three levels, as well as us trying to define what the three levels are and what they are not. So at the micro level, again, I think the really nice advancement is this idea of how individuals construct narratives. And so that is Melissa's work and Kathy's work, Aaron's work, and others. I think if I was looking for like a research angle to really explore in the MPF, I would look at the individual as a constructor of narrative. I think that is a really open research area. At the meso level, again, is how groups use narrative. There's some methodological issues, I think, with at the meso level, and that is that it's difficult. It's more difficult to get large databases because it relies on human coding, and we know there are efforts to use machine coding, and I know Liz is doing some of that, and she can talk to that. But the meso level, I think, I always stress in the group, I don't want to see the meso level decline in influence because I think it's the heart of what the MPF is about, which is how groups use narrative strategically. So I'm hoping to see more work in machine coding and how we can have machine coding and not lose the human touch. So I'm still a little bit skeptical about machine coding and narratives and how that's going to work, because I think the idea of context and the idea of how you read and interpret a narrative, I think, is really important in the coding. And then lastly, when we look at the macro level, we have some really, this is really the first edition in the Theories of the Policy Process where we have some really significant work occurring. Not that the previous work, there was some little, there were just small amounts of work previously in the macro. But I believe in our first edition in Theories in the Policy Process, there were actually no macro levels. So the work's kind of dividing into two areas. So there's kind of the institutional approach to grand narratives, and that's work by Holly Peterson, right? And then at the cultural level, and I just wanted to highlight, we spent quite a bit of time with an article by Williams and Kuzma that used cultural theory and content analysis to look at salmon policy, genetically modified salmon policy in Canada. And I think that's a really interesting contribution. And then there's a work by Stauffer, where her work on Swiss child and adult protective services at the macro level, and we discussed that fairly extensively in the chapter. And her work kind of combines both the macro level at the institutional level and the cultural level. So anyway, I think it's exciting because it's giving us some idea of where the macro is going. And I have not worked a lot in the macro level. I would like to. I think that is an area for you to explore. And then my last point is, I think if you're going to look for places to explore in the MPF, is look at how the levels interact. I think if we can get some understanding of the connection between the meso and micro level, and then actually all three levels, I think that would be an area I would like to explore MPF research. And particularly if I was just starting in the MPF, that's an area where I think you can find lots of gaps in the literature to fill. So that is kind of my quick discussion of levels of analysis.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. We're going to ask last questions to Geoboo, and then we're going to turn it up for anybody to ask questions to you all. And I think Mike said he'd take all the hard questions, so get them ready, start sharpening your sword. So Geoboo, to you, we wanted to ask you about any particularly compelling methodological trends and innovations that you're seeing. I know you were specifically a part of the methods, the blue chapter as well. And then the other question for you, Geoboo, is that you have this particular perspective as editor of PSJ, and we know that all of these changes in the NPF are happening in a dynamic relationship to other policy process theories. We wanted to ask you to both share with us a little bit about methodological advancement, but also this discussion of NPF in the context of other developments, changes, and advances across the field of major policy process theories.
Yeah, thank you. I need to admit that I really appreciate you inviting me to this sort of panel discussion, but I should admit that my contribution to this MPH scholarship MPF scholarship has been pretty limited compared to all other people they've talked about. So I just want to talk about it first. I just frame this question and kind of think about the answers, but I think most of the discussion up to this point is focusing on internal validity, and MPF is relatively young, maybe slightly over 10 years, but it's extremely successful, and I can see that every day. I looked at manuscripts submitted by MPF scholars in relation to other sort of mainstream policy theory and frameworks. So most recent piece, Fagan et al., they did a really cool historical analysis on PSA articles, which reflects the sort of policy theory development or policy scholarship development. And when you look at those things, MPF obviously got a very important spot, even compared to, PET or ACF and things like that, right? So there's something sort of context that kind of need to think about it. But mostly I'm going to talk about sort of a more broad external validity of MPF, which is really, really broadly defined. So when you think about the methodology, probably some of those components are going to be related to that sort of external validity. So one thing that hasn't been discussed up to this point is that what are the relationship between MPF and then other existing theories, right? So I know sort of earlier work, maybe Lee's and others, that talked about MPF in the context of ACF and then kind of separated out, and it becomes its own, unique framework that has a unique identity, right? But those are the things that we can kind of think about. Holly Peterson talked about those MPF work in relations with PET, for example, right? So narrative attention. So those are the things that that create a lot of avenues for future research. And another external validity is that, and that's pretty common based on my own observation for the past 20 years. When you look at the sort of theoretical development in other kind of framework in the US, mostly driven by US scholars. The assumption is plurality democracy, and then kind of spread out to European scholars, mostly Western Europe first, and then move out to some Asian, Latin America and things like that, right? So this MPF work predominantly, done by American scholars and European scholars are gonna work in other sort of regional or geographical context, right? That's something that kind of need to think about in terms of future research. They're also related to other political regimes. So, some of you already mentioned that, but well, it's a democracy, but would that work? Authoritarian regime? If so, how, right? That's a sort of new avenue for future research. And also policy topics. When you look at the Fagan et al. Piece, most of the previous MPF work tend to focus on environmental energy policy areas. More recently, now we have education policy, gun control issues, animal rights, but there are a lot of other policy areas that haven't been discussed. So this is broadly part of sort of checking external validity of this framework and all the theories that you talked about, right? So that's that. More specifically, I think that the big question from a methodological perspective is that still, we discussed that a little bit, but ontology and epistemology. So I know when Mark and Mike published a PhD article back in 2010, it was quite clear to me that it's a sort of very, very Popperian, positivist kind of assumption that they had. So the MPF work is mostly based upon scientific method that Karl Popper would suggest, right? But then I know that there's a tension between sort of positivist versus interpretivist approach, and how we're gonna sort of navigate those tensions, how we can sort of translate that sort of tension, energy from the tension into much more constructive way for understanding policy process, especially the role of narratives within the policy process, right? So that's another sort of a broad thing. Aaron already mentioned that, but normative versus empirical research, right? So we have enough or sufficient number of empirical research done, but then what is the connection between that and then sort of a normative sort of status of sort of political system and democracy. And Kathy and I had a brief, sort of a discussion the other day. But how about, because most of the mainstream policy theories are by nature elitist sort of theories, and that's the empirical findings, right? We found that mostly those policy making is done by influential and powerful people or actors. But then is that it should be the normative sort of end from our researcher, and so that's something that we kind of need to think about too, right?
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, and then more specific analytical method, we already talked about quantitative content analysis and mixed method. That's going to be still continue and sort of refine. More recently, computational text analysis and machine learning requires a lot of sophistication in terms of data analysis. And then experiment method, I think is sort of survey experiment-based experimental method is a little bit limited. So maybe we can work a little bit further. So those are the sort of methodical trends when you think about the specific tools of method. But the more recently, I think that the sort of generative AI, right? So we kind of need to think about how we're going to use those AI tools to do this kind of research, both in terms of content analysis and applied machine learning, and then also maybe simulation-based experiment, and then see how that works in sort of a simulated work, right? So those are the sort of new opportunities for many MPF scholars here. So
Great. So we're going to turn now, Geoboo, thank you for that. And thanks to all of our panelists. I wonder if, I actually don't know if I can see. So if you have a question, I invite you to unmute and share your question or comment in response. I think I will turn to the other panelists just for a second, and I had promised you beforehand that I'd let you respond to each other, and then I kept going on to the next question. So is there anything from your fellow panelists that you would respond to as a panelist to take issue with, or to build on or expand or underline?
I don't take issue with any of my co-authors. We speak with one mind and one voice. No, that's not the case. But I do want to highlight some of the work that's being done, especially on the three levels. I see that Meg Hassey's here, and she's working in her dissertation. She's at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and she's working at exploring some of the narratives that are going on at the UN around plastics and treaties. And that's a level, right, which is sort of supranational, and she has lots of things that are sort of new there, because I think that the NPF, as Mark pointed out, really was looking at the meso level, and then Holly's approach for sort of attacking the macro level is to think about US macro level institutions. And so I think that those three that we have, right, the micro, meso, and macro, they're not the be all and end all, right? I think that there could be other, right, formulations that are out there, and so I would encourage people to to think about those, because as we move into a new era of climate politics, where it's going to require multinational responses, right? We have linked production, consumption, and disposal networks spanning the globe, right? We have this other level, and how do we think about actors at that level, right? How do these delegations act? Do they act differently than meso level coalitions in a national institutional setting? So I think that those are things that
it's how the levels get complicated, right? Yeah, because we could understand on the one hand they're groups, but I think you're saying, do groups act differently if it's sort of a supranational? That's interesting. Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. It goes back to the levels seem simple and then they get complex. Mark, before you go, I know you have to teach class. Is there any sort of final words or thoughts that you would share, particularly about the construction of this chapter or sort of where you see the NPF going?
I think I'll mute myself. So I think we're making really interesting changes. And we're doing, we're doing a book project. I don't know if that's public or not, but it's not like it's a secret. But we started a book project that we met actually in Pocatello in May, early June, and then we're starting to work on it now. We just met on Monday. I think there's some really, really unexplored areas of the NPF that this has been going on for about 20 years, and if you go back to the pre-NPF times. But now, like just on characters, Aaron and I had a meeting on characters last week, and there's just so many unexplored areas of characters and how characters evolve and the different types of characters. And so I just think that is, I think you're not joining, if you're new to the NPF, you're not joining like an old framework that's dying out. I think it's a young framework that's still growing and still getting better. And the more people we have involved, the more great changes we're going to see. So I just say, like, look for our book. We're still like more than a year out from that book coming out, but I'm really excited about the book project, because it's not just going to be a book project. Here's what we've done. Aren't we great? It's going to be, here's how we advance the NPF. So that's kind of my parting comments, and I will leave my email in the chat. If anyone has any questions, they can send me an email.
Great, and have a good class. Thanks for being with us. All right, Liz Shanahan, you're putting intriguing concepts in the chat about memorable messages and about forward thinking. So would you unmute and just share some, either comment on those a little bit more or share some sort of final thoughts as we close up the panel and move into our next?
So I didn't know if we were allowed to talk about the book, Mike.
So, apparently you are.
Yeah, I guess so. And Rachel is involved, and Rachel is, with Mark's undergrad, and now is Mike's PhD student. And my job, my directive for both of them is to leave her alone, but I can't because she's so amazing. But anyway, the book is going to be, it's really fun. It's a couple years out, but it's, I just think that and I think Mark's comment of, we need the community to advance the NPF. And and so we're really grateful for ideas, for challenges, pokes and prods, and I'm just super happy, and I'm really grateful, Kathy Honeyhule, for putting this all together.
Thanks, Liz. What a great way for us to think about this going forward. So in the spirit of that, we will end our panel discussion, but you can say, I'm also like, if there's any last words from the panelists, or if there's any last questions, squeeze them in right now.
I have one.
Go for it, Mike. Go for it. Yeah.
Just one quick kind of thing that I don't think the NPF gets enough credit for, but just how adaptive the framework is. So I think Melissa Mary's gone now, but we just published an article with Yale Kaplan that uses an entirely different operationalization of the NPF structural components. It's based off of Shanahan's work. And the NPF is epistemologically adaptable. You can apply any method. Theoretically, it's very malleable. And I just don't know. I think people read these chapters in these books and they come away with the idea that it's canonical, that we put this stuff down and that this is how it has to be, and that this is somehow received from Zeus on Mount Olympus or something like that. And that's just not the case. The NPF is a bottom-up approach, and you all are a part of developing it. And we really, really try to do justice to the work that you've done and the ideas that you have when we put these things together. And I know there are some mistakes in there, and I know that maybe we missed some folks, and that certainly is not intentional, and we'll do better next time.
Thanks, Mike. What a good, I think you and Liz are both making that really, really clear that this is a community project. And I think that you all, I appreciated how you started this, that you saw the responsibility of putting a chapter together like this and tried to take that seriously, took on that responsibility and agreed to do that, but are also really asking for the support of the community and doing that well. And that you need us to step up, and I think we often do, right? To try and build this together. We have an open, sort of an open discussion time now for kind of anything you want to put out there. And I think Honey's going to facilitate that for us. So I just want to thank the panelists one last time. Really quickly, I will say we are going to do this again. We'll have another monthly meeting in October. It'll be October 22nd. So this will be a Tuesday at 10 a.m. Our main panel discussion is going to be about the NPF, applications of the NPF outside of North America. And we have 3 great panelists, Claudio Rodelli, Caroline Schlaufer, and Juhi Huda are going to be our panelists for that. And we'll have many other people that are working outside of North America, and we want you all to chime in as well. So hopefully that'll be interesting to a number of people. And it's also really based on the desire that came out of those surveys that our community be more connected globally, that we understand both the application of NPF in many different cultures, and that also we're building research projects together potentially out of this. So be paying attention to that. All right, I'll turn it over to you, Honey.
So this is an open discussion time. And I think I'll just start with general reactions to our panelists and the information that was presented today. Are there any thoughts or feelings or general reactions regarding what we heard today?
Well, I would like to say that I am arriving to use the framework, even though I already had learned about it in my policy class at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and yeah, and read some papers of it and hear some conferences at MPSA conference last year about it. I am really starting to use that in my dissertation process. And well, just listening to you and to this panel, it just comes to my mind. I think what one of you were saying that the framework is having progress, like kind of maybe fast, but it's moving forward. So I just want I just hope that the concepts or the constructs or the terms that I use are not, I don't know if old-fashioned when my dissertation goes out. But I think that anyway, there are structural concepts that are the pillars of this framework that are super and very useful for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. Etienne?
Hi, can you hear me? Yes? Great.
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm trying to put video as well. Yeah, thank you. So thanks, first of all, Dr. Jones, for inviting me over to this workshop. I heard it about the NPF very honestly during the conference in Syracuse. And I think I have a talk scheduled with Aaron soon. Hopefully the move is going well. So I have been working in advocacy coalitions for over 20 years, but I transitioned in a PhD to IR, and I'm trying to travel the concepts a little bit in terms of policy formulation at an international level, and using narratives to operationalize that kind of analysis. And I was really curious about what Professor Aaron was saying about another colleague who's also studying UN policy formulation, quote unquote, and what level that would be. I don't know if you have more information about that, or perhaps you could share more about her research offline. But this is what I'm trying to do with the COVID-19 response, and trying to apply some of the concepts of the framework to that particular case as well. Thank you so much, honey.
Yeah, Etienne, it's actually funny because Meg is sitting right next to you on my Zoom screen. So I see the two of you together, and she's actually in the same area that we are. So maybe when we make arrangements to meet, she might be able to join us, or I can connect you as well.
Yeah.
So
Aaron, I just dropped my email in the chat.
Oh, great, Meg. I didn't know if you could talk. So this is actually much easier because you know more about what you're doing than I do. So this is great.
Yeah, Etienne, I am happy to chat with you. I would love to talk with you and talk through what I'm seeing and finding as I go through these UN documents. So please reach out.
Will do. Thank you both.
Are there any other further, yes, Charlie Thompson raised his hand.
Hi, apologies, I joined late because I had a conflicting meeting. So I guess my question or comment might have been addressed already, or kind of is displaced in this section, but I guess I'll answer or ask it anyway. So it's more of a general question that anyone can kind of answer. So my question is, how can kind of the NPF, or how does the NPF view tackling more kind of comparative narrative approaches going forward? That is in kind of these more cross-national policy trajectories, and how certain policy narratives may be present in context B but absent in context C, or how can we kind of explain why certain narratives emerge in one context but not in the other? Thank you.
I'll take a swing at that real fast. Aaron and I wrote about comparative NPF a few years back, and I think that the simple answer to that question is all of that is pretty wide open, and I think we're recognizing that there's a need for studies that deal with our very generalizable concepts in the different contexts that they emerge, because we see different effects. I mean, we see some things that are sort of trending in a probabilistic way, but there's enough variation that we know context isn't being taken seriously enough. And those comparative types of approaches are going to be a big deal in sorting out that context. And so we need people doing good comparative work, is what I would say.
Yeah, I'm going to just add that. And I mean, the other way to kind of think about that is that the main focus, not all the research, but main focus of NPF work so far, at least from an empirical perspective, is that it's a sort of a subsystem level analysis, right? So what you're talking about is that, well, what if the system level parameters are different, and how that have an impact on dynamics of the parameters within subsystem, right? So more recent work, you do, some of the scholars apply NPF in other authoritarian regime, for example, right? And we know that those system level parameters there are different. You can call it an NPF sort of framework. Well, that's the macro level parameters that we're talking about, right? And then Mark talked about, well, what is the interaction between macro versus meso, right? So maybe that's another way to kind of think about those things. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of opportunities out there.
Excellent. Are there any other thoughts or reactions? We have about 2 more minutes for discussion. Okay. Not seeing any other questions, comments, or thoughts for discussion. I'm gonna turn it back over to, I believe, Kathy to wrap up. Oh no, I'm sorry. Back to Ulay to wrap up.
Thank you. So thank you all for participating and sharing your thoughts. We prepared a Google form. I will just send it in the chat, where you can let us know if you have any ideas for topics that you would like to see discussed. Right now, the topics we have scheduled are pretty much inspired by the RNC survey. So just to give you a sneak peek on what we've got planned, like next week, as Kathy already said, next time, as Kathy already said, we're planning to discuss applications beyond North America. But we're also going to dive more into methods. We want to discuss innovations in coding, but also more qualitative approaches if you're interested in that. And then also connected to other research fields such as communications. So we're really excited for the next year. We are really thankful for all who have participated. It's great to see so many faces. Yeah, I think information about the next meetings will be shared on the NPF website. It's narrativepolicyframework.org. In case you don't know it, it will be updated within the next few weeks. We will probably also put the Google form where you can provide input and ideas for the meetings in there. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to contact any of us. Also, if you want to make announcements at the meeting, I mean, you can also always do it spontaneously, but you can also always write us an email. And I think, yeah, thanks to all of you. Is there anything you would like to add, Honey, Kathy?
Same as you. It's so exciting to see this group of people come together, and we're hoping that it's useful, and we welcome your feedback through the form and in any other ways.
And lastly, the recording will be made available and will be on the website within the next couple of weeks. I have to add a section to the website to do that. Again, soliciting for help for the website. If anyone here is interested, available, or you know someone, please reach out to me. I could definitely and would very much appreciate support. So thank you.
All right, everybody have a great rest of your day. Classes, reading, figuring out those teenage kids and rocking out Lego sets, whatever the day may bring to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, that was fun.